Hello, everyone. I am Professor Antônio Gasparetto Júnior from Federal University of Juiz de Fora, and this is the course Crisis Management in the Public and Private Sectors, part of Global July 2025, held by Federal University of Juiz de Fora. I'm professor at the Master Degree of Public Administration at the same university, and I'm very glad to receive you today for our special class, Collaborating in Crisis, Professor Paul Verbinnen. It's here. Paul Verbinnen is a co-chair of North America FGS Global, works with a wide range of clients on complex matters, crises, and special situations, and he is a co-author of Collaborative Crisis Management, Prepare, Execute, Recover, Repeat, published by the University of Chicago Press in the fall of 2022. I'm very glad to receive you here. Thank you for accepting the invitation, Professor Paul Verbinnen. Welcome to our online class in Brazil from Federal University of Juiz de Fora. And please be free. This is your word.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my session on collaborating in crisis. And a big thank you to Antonio for inviting me. First, a little on my background. I actually planned to be a lawyer, but changed course in the late 1970s and fell into public relations and strategic communications somewhat accidentally. Later joining Ogilvy and Mather's public relations business in '83, spending 5 years in Hong Kong, first as the head of that office and then as head of the Asia region. And then I moved to London as head of international. I co-founded Sard Verbinnen and Company with George Sard in 1992. We quickly became the world's leading M&A communications advisor, and we also built a leading crisis capability. In 2013, Bloomberg called us Wall Street's go-to crisis firm, and in 2022, we helped to create FGS Global, as Antonio mentioned, the world's leading stakeholder strategy firm. Today we have 1,500 consultants and about 30 offices around the world. Besides M&A, crisis management and communications has always been a primary focus for me personally. It's a demanding and often stressful line of work, but I've always found it to be exciting and challenging. You're always drinking from the proverbial fire hose. Everything needs immediate attention late at night, over weekends, and often over holidays. It can blow up family vacations, long planned dinners with friends, and so on. Fortunately, I've been blessed with a supportive spouse who's put up with my crazy schedule for over 40 years. Also, fortunately, for the most part, I can look back over my career and point to mostly successful outcomes. But I've also learned many lessons, including some hard ones along the way. And today I'll try and share some of those with you over the next 30 to 40 minutes. And then after that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Each crisis is different, of course, and you need to assess and analyze it by its own facts. And you need to bring your own judgment to the table so that you can give the best advice. Besides the obvious, pressure in crisis management also comes from the fact that missteps can cost millions and sometimes billions of dollars in market capitalization and significantly complicate recovery efforts. Over the last 40 years, I've seen the practice of crisis management and communications develop considerably. To take one example, one of the best known crisis case histories of all time was the Tylenol poisonings case in 1982. Much has been written about that case, and I encourage you to study it if you're interested. The short version of that was that the Tylenol murders were a series of poisoning deaths resulting from criminal drug tampering. The Tylenol brand was owned by Johnson & Johnson. The victims consumed Tylenol painkillers that had been laced with poison, and at least 7 people died in the original poisonings, plus there were a number of others in copycat cases. Management of that case by J&J is still seen as the gold standard, and basic principles still apply. J&J did a very good job in managing that crisis. They responded quickly. They took responsibility for addressing stakeholder concerns. They pulled the product from the market. They made clear that safety was their highest priority. And they led the charge for anti-tampering requirements in drug packaging. And today, that's why all over-the-counter medications are tamper-resistant. Back then, however, crisis management and communications was slightly less complicated than it is today. In 1982, in the US anyway, there were only 3 major TV networks, plus a fledgling CNN, and there were only a few print and wire news outlets of any consequence. Today, the speed and necessary response time for dealing with a crisis is increased and compressed dramatically. More media outlets exist than ever before. There's a 24/7 news cycle driven by social media. There are more stakeholders that demand to be informed. And as everybody knows, there's significantly more ill-informed commentary out there and lots more litigation. I've seen this explosion in complexity firsthand over the last 40 years. A discussion around this phenomenon with Tom Cole, a lawyer I'd worked with for over 30 years, led to the writing and publication of our book, as Antonio mentioned, Collaborative Crisis Management. Antonio, if you'd go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. Tom, by the way, was chair of the executive committee of Sidley, one of the world's largest law firms. And he's one of the smartest, most collaborative lawyers I've ever been privileged to work alongside. And we talked often about how important it was to collaborate, again, leading to the publication of the book. Tom's still a renowned board whisperer and advisor. So why did we title it Collaborative Crisis Management? For the reason I just said. As I'll discuss, collaborating with the right people in preparing, executing, and recovering from a crisis is essential. But surprisingly, it's not always what people and companies do well. Preparing means identifying the right team in advance, developing a plan, and sitting down regularly with that team to discuss what could go wrong and what you would do if it did. In my view, the best crisis plan always starts with a short list of the right 5 to 6 key people that you can reach at any time of day or night. It's a fact that big binders full of plans, while they're important, often go by the wayside in an actual crisis. In order to be useful, they must be continually updated. Go to the next slide. Just a quick but important note on crisis leadership. It's hugely important to have the right people who are temperamentally suited to the task. They must be inquisitive, collaborative, thoughtful, calm, and deliberative, but decisive. Peggy Noonan, a well-known columnist for the Wall Street Journal, wrote in 2020, "Leaders in crisis function as many things. They're primary givers of information, so they have to know the facts. They must master the data. Are they managerially competent? Most of all, are they trustworthy and credible? Or do people sense that they're spinning, finagling, covering up failures, or shading facts?" It's in a crisis that you see the difference between showmanship and leadership. And that's one of my favorite parts of that whole quote. I think Peggy encapsulated the essence of crisis management very well. And the principal goal is to maintain credibility throughout. The next slide, please. Probably the biggest mistake people make is failing to prepare. In our book, Tom and I devoted a lot of time to the idea of advanced preparation. Let's take a look at what that means. Next slide, please. Risk, compliance, and preparedness is huge. Crisis management is about business or organizational continuity when something goes sideways. And for every company, on almost every organization, there will be something that goes sideways. In preparing, you need to ask what can go wrong. What are the mission critical issues that you need to deal with to ensure continuity and to protect the business? What's your overall risk profile? What about disruptive technologies or the failed execution of a new strategy? Is your balance sheet strong enough to handle shocks? Do you have adequate liquidity? What about fires, floods, accidents, lawsuits? Do you have strong compliance policies for your people? What about cyber risk or political and regulatory risk? What about problems with your supply chain, your own products, and so on? And have you considered black swan events? Tom and I wrote our book during COVID, a pure example of a black swan event. We were both busy during COVID on business continuity for a wide range of clients who were scrambling to figure out how to keep their businesses running while everyone was at home. Next slide, please. This slide has a list of what are traditional risk management elements. Part of being prepared is taking time to review those elements, such as insurance. Do you have it? Do you have adequate insurance for all the potential things that could happen? Do you have quality control procedures in place? Is your capital structure sufficient to handle a shock from a significant crisis? Is your management structure and staffing and compensation design appropriate? Have you reviewed it in the context of how you would manage things if you were stressed in a crisis? Are your IT systems robust? And do you have whistleblower hotlines to encourage people to flag issues that could cause problems? And do you wargame? Do you conduct wargame exercises and rehearsals to keep you sharp in the event of a crisis? Next slide, please. This slide has other vital risk elements, including reputation management. Have you built trust and credibility in your company over time? Having done so helps enormously in crisis. When you put a strong reputation, you have a strong bank of trust out in the public. It helps you enormously. Your corporate culture. Do you encourage communication? This is really important in a case history I'll get into later. Do you encourage communication, and does bad news or do emerging problems get flagged early so that you can address problems before they balloon into a more severe crisis? You need to think about shareholder activism. Is your investor relations department attuned to growing discontent among investors? Many companies these days are trying to be their own activists so that they can identify these issues before they become significant with investors. And learning from peer companies is also hugely important. When you see a company, a peer company or competitor, have a problem, you need to study it and use it as an opportunity to learn. Maybe you can learn from and avoid their mistakes. Next slide, please. This slide has categories of crisis. Why is this important? Because when you look at it, it helps you understand. When you look at a crisis and you try and put it into one of the four buckets that we've broken it down into, you can generally plan around the fact that each has different elements, different levels of risk, and the implications for the eventual recovery and reputation fixing, if you will. The four buckets, two internally generated and two externally generated, are one, is it core to the business, an internally generated crisis? Situations like the Boeing 737 MAX, Takata airbags, BP's Deepwater Horizon well blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. Is it internally generated and not directly related to the core business? For example, bad behavior by or the sudden death of a senior executive. Is it externally generated? Is it cybersecurity hack or sabotage like the Tylenol murders? Or is it externally generated in the form of disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, COVID, war? Think of all the companies that had to pull out of the Ukraine and Russia after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Next slide, please. These are the basic phases of a crisis. Informally, the first one, I think, is the hair on fire, the euphemism. It usually happens in the first day of a week while everyone is running around trying to figure out what's happened and so on. It's important that you have a team around you, as I described earlier, that can stay calm. You can gather information quickly, assess what your initial public response needs to be. Do you need an apology or a holding statement? Is that appropriate? What kind of outreach do you need for shareholders and stakeholders? What are the threats to business continuity? You need to answer all of those questions in the span of 24 hours, usually. You need to sort it out in the second phase, and that is where second order issues normally arise. Lawsuits, activists, financial implications become more apparent as the costs of managing the crisis obviously were not in your original plan. Regulatory inquiries, media inquiries need to be dealt with, and there are customer problems to resolve. It's also, unfortunately, when the blame game and finger pointing can become especially acute if you haven't prepared and really thought through the issues and have a team that's working together. You need to manage that so that it doesn't undermine team unity in addressing the issues. And I've seen that happen in many, many crises. It's important to try and avoid it by preparing up front. And finally, well, almost finally, there's the recovery, which is where you try to understand how you got into the crisis in the first place. What was the root cause? And then you consider philanthropy, advertising, customer initiatives, and other public relations efforts to repair whatever damages has resulted from the crisis and to try and win back confidence. And finally, there's the assessments, learning, and go forward period, where you try and figure out how you can use the crisis learnings to actually become a better company and use the learnings to be even better prepared for the next crisis. Next slide, please. This concentric circle slide from our book has long served as an organizational tool for me and a way to prioritize the stakeholders in a particular situation and to continue and consider the feedback loops that exist naturally in and outside of any organization. Put another way, what do we need to say? When do we say it, and to whom? Those aren't always the same concentric circles for every crisis. They change depending on what the crisis is. But I usually start figuring out who do we need to talk to and what order. And this tool's always been helpful to me. The center group representing, the center group representing the core 5 or 6 people. Again, I'll go back to, it's hugely important to have the right people in the room. In this particular concentric circles diagram, I have a number of executive positions, but sometimes the senior most person in some of those positions isn't always the right person to handle the crisis. You need, again, to find people who are temperamentally suited. As I said, calm, deliberate, and decisive. If that group's messaging is not tight and they are not all aligned on the crisis response and messaging, you can be sure that this messaging to other stakeholders in the outer rings won't be tight either, leading to mistakes and confusion. It's important to consider also that there's a feedback loop. As the crisis unfolds, that you're getting information from those groups to determine if you need to take additional steps or change course in your response. Next slide, please. I hope you can tell from what I've said so far is that there's a lot to think about in crisis management, both in preparation for one and in the execution and resolution of one. Next 3 sides are a quick summary. First, going back to the idea of collaboration, it's absolutely key between a board and company leadership, among internal and external multidisciplinary functional teams, needs to be led by a team leader, such as described by Peggy Noonan, with judgment and authority to mediate differences of opinion among team leaders. And as I've said several times, being prepared in advance for what can go wrong can increase your chances of avoiding a crisis or make it easier to manage one if it does happen. It includes the traditional and other vital risk managements I spoke of earlier. Next slide. The main point of this slide is that it's important to be nimble, recognizing the dynamic and fast-changing nature of crises. There's governance. Do you do a small board committee? Do you have a small committee of the board that's focused on supervising what's going on and providing guidance from the board? Do you have separate teams to handle the management of a crisis while others focus on keeping normal business operations going? Again, what about your liquidity? Have costs ballooned to a point that you did not anticipate? What do you need to do? If you've got financial guidance in the marketplace, you might need to withdraw that guidance. Are you taking appropriate accounting reserves for what you might have to shell out later in litigation or other fixes to the crisis? And what kinds of legal disclosures need to be made? Do you conduct investigations into what happened or how it happened? And are you prepared for potential long tail litigation, which is expensive? Next slide, please. And this slide covers the communications and HR aspects. I've already talked about stakeholder ID and prioritization. You also have to prepare for the media and government inquiries. Media in particular like to keep stories in the press, particularly crises, as long as they can. And so managing those has to be done by people who know what they're doing and can work with the media constructively. And then there's HR, your people. In a crisis, morale suffers. Some people leave, some people are upset. You need a lot of attention on how people are handling things. And you need frontline readiness for those who have to manage customers and answer questions. And finally, on that point, you also have to address potential actions and consequences for people that you may ultimately hold responsible for the crisis. Next slide, please. I want to do a fairly quick case history on the Boeing Max, which I think is just an incredible story of what happened to an iconic company. So the Boeing 737 Max crisis, which is about 7 years out, is still impacting the company. As a bit of background, I was actually involved with Boeing in announcing the Brazilian Embraer deal in 2018. That deal eventually fell apart for a number of reasons, but not in small part due to the 737 crisis and the almost simultaneous COVID pandemic. I was brought back to Boeing well after the first Max crash in Indonesia and only a short while before the second crash in Ethiopia in 2019. Boeing was one of the most interesting and most complicated situations I'd ever worked on, and candidly, one of the most frustrating. To this day, I always think about what might have been done differently by everyone involved, and this case certainly further refined and shaped my approach to dealing with crisis situations. It had everything: cascading issues, aggrieved victims, poor information flow, siloed functions, poor collaboration, finger pointing, strong differences around communication strategy, controlled communications or get out there to do lots of interviews, frankly defending what soon became the indefensible, an initial narrative that turned out not to be credible and which fueled a growing perception that Boeing was inappropriately blaming pilots. There was some tone-deaf advertising, there were whistleblowers and bad internal emails that contributed to criminal charges. The prep for government testimony was done only by the lawyers, which meant for an overly legalistic approach, pretty much the same mistake that was made by the university presidents at Harvard, UPenn, and MIT when called on by the US Congress to address anti-Semitism at their schools. The board was rightly worried about its liability, looking over their own shoulders. They established a board safety committee, which was a good move, but ultimately, and unfortunately, it was too little too late for the situation. And there were unaddressed cultural issues at Boeing, which contributed significantly to the crisis, specifically the growing sense that financial concerns might have outweighed their focus on safety. Some of this was driven by union priorities, but it became apparent that real internal concerns around Boeing's culture were being ignored. It also dragged in, for those of you who remember the crisis and may have read about it, it dragged in the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and regulators around the world, including the Brazilian regulators, igniting a debate around how the relationships work between the manufacturers and the regulatory bodies. It also sparked the same debate among other aviation regulators around the world. There's so many lessons that can be taken from this case, but one should stand out, is that even well-respected, iconic, and highly successful companies can become complacent and arrogant, failing to contemplate black swan events and forgetting that winning in the court of public opinion is often more important than winning in court. Next slide, please. The Max crash in Indonesia happened a little more than a year after the 737 Max had been introduced to the market. This is sort of a timeline of the crisis. And as terrible as that situation was, it was handled initially the way any crash is under standard operating procedures. Specifically, Boeing deferred to the National Transportation Safety Board as the lead agency in investigating U.S. aviation accidents and accidents involving U.S. manufactured aircraft abroad. Parties to an NTSB investigation like Boeing are restricted from making public comments about the causes or contributing factors of an accident while the investigation is ongoing. Pilot error was suspected by Boeing, but the problem was the new MAX had new flight control system called MCAS that apparently was not well known to pilots or to the broader aviation community at the time. MCAS, or Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, its full name, of course, later proved to be a central implicating factor in the crisis. In October of 2018, the day of the first crash, Boeing issued a brief public statement expressing condolences. They also stated that it was providing technical assistance to the investigation, consistent with international protocols, and that it would cooperate fully with Indonesian authorities and the NTSB. Boeing's response was pretty standard playbook stuff at the time, but unfortunately it quickly became clear it was inadequate as more information came in. Even as MCAS became speculated about, Boeing insisted that pilots should be able to deal with it using normal protocols. Under some pressure in November, they had to issue an alert to airlines noting that there was a problem, a potential issue with the angle of attack sensors and incorrect MCAS activations. In November, shortly afterwards, the FAA issued an emergency airworthy directive, basically advising pilots how to respond to potential MCAS misfires. Pilots in the US and around the world took note. This discovery about MCAS significantly undermined Boeing's credibility going into the end of 2018. I wasn't involved at the time, but came on later as Boeing sought to pull together a team to address the increasing number of questions that had arisen as a result of the crash and the MCAS revelation. When I did come on board, candidly, I initially took more at face value the explanation that continued to be provided by the engineers, some of the best in the world, including Boeing's CEO at the time, who was actually very well-meaning, but unfortunately he was run over by events. Then on March 10th, 2019, a second crash happened. Again, MCAS was heavily implicated. Despite increasing skepticism and concerns raised internally and by many others, Boeing engineers and lawyers refused to change their initial narrative. Again, most of them were also well-meaning and understandably, but unfortunately defensive. They simply couldn't fathom that there was a real issue with the software, and they tended to lean towards the theory that it was pilot error, a theory that increasingly agitated pilots, and they began speaking up publicly. The lawyers quickly locked things down even more tightly, siloing the information flow from the rest of the team and girding to limit damage from what became inevitable lawsuits. Basically, they stuck with the old playbook too long. All stakeholders, regulators, employees, investors, regulators, politicians, and customers started asking more pointed questions. The initial response, driven by the lawyers, echoed the statement from after the first crash, and over the next 48 to 72 hours, Boeing continued to defend the safety of the plane, stating it was safe to fly and had undergone rigorous certification by the FAA. This generated a whole new wave of coverage around regulatory capture and calls for reforming the FAA's certification process. It became frustrating for everyone. The organization had hunkered down and wasn't thinking broadly enough about the problem. They were deer in the headlights, and the teams charged with figuring out what to do were all in different places, operating independently without enough information to do so effectively and wisely. In short, real collaboration was not happening the way it should have. In March, as regulators worldwide began grounding the 737 MAX, Boeing continued to resist, emphasizing confidence in the plane. After the FAA grounded the aircraft, Boeing issued a statement reiterating full confidence in safety of the plane and saying that they recommended to the FAA the temporary suspension of operations. In my view, candidly, the statement was inadequate to the situation given the emerging information. But again, everybody was in different places and the lawyers had locked down the communications. At the same time, there was lots of pressure put on comms people to get the CEO out there, talking to people about the issue. The problem in debate was that the approved narrative clearly had no credibility at that point. At the April 2019 annual shareholder meeting, the CEO gave his first press conference, mostly reiterating essentially the original narrative, losing even more credibility. It wasn't until June that Boeing seriously changed its tune. On June 16th, during an impromptu session at the Paris Air Show, the CEO finally acknowledged the issue was not just a glitch. He acknowledged that Boeing's handling of the failure was not consistent, deemed it unacceptable, and he described the situation as a mistake, acknowledging it went beyond a single hiccup. This was probably something that he should have done much earlier. But it was unfortunately the earliest instance where he explicitly rejected the idea that the issue was minor or bureaucratic, instead of framing it as a significant lapse in Boeing, and instead, he did fortunately frame it as a significant lapse in Boeing's communication internal processes. While that created a ton of news, it was the first step in moving forward. There were many twists and turns after that, but unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, it was required. He resigned in December 2019 and was replaced by the lead director, who had been on the board for many years. The plane was finally cleared to fly again in late 2020, but not without significant reputational damage to Boeing, damage from which it is still not completely recovered. The episode engendered big cultural changes at Boeing, and the CEO is there today has made great strides in getting the company back on track. Next slide, please. Key takeaway, key lesson is, while challenging, especially in large organizations like a Boeing, it's important to convene senior leadership, key disciplines, and independent thinkers and advisors quickly to share perspectives on a crisis. In short, collaboration. This didn't happen. It was actively resisted through much of the early stages of their crisis, and it resulted in a number of disconnected and poorly conceived initiatives. The situation also required a trusted quarterback to marshal the resources and people. This didn't happen. And establishing credibility early and keeping it is vital. This also didn't happen. And while legal concerns are important, they should not override business imperatives, common sense, and a human response. Boeing was excoriated for not doing enough early enough for the victims, and Boeing was trounced in the court of public opinion. Next slide, please. Boeing has certainly had to go through this phase, but the process is relevant for everyone. After a crisis, in the recovery phase, you need to ask yourselves important questions. We call them the 5 whys. Why did it happen and what caused the direct issue at hand? Why was it not addressed earlier before it became an issue? And where did the direct responsibility lie? Why did more senior people not identify and address the issues and imperatives that might have allowed the situation to develop? Why did the breakdown occur? Were there cultural issues and imperatives that should have been addressed or that need to be addressed? And why were there compliance issues that the board should have identified and asked about sooner? And you have to begin what can be a long process of reputation rehab, internal and external, leveraging employees, online efforts, philanthropy, public and customer relations initiatives. Next slide, please. And the final stage, before you repeat, and part of repeating, is, and this is effectively the repeat section of our book. How did it go? What did we learn? How can we be better prepared for the next one, the next crisis? How can you use the crisis to become a better company in future? These are all the kinds of questions that you need to ask so that you can go back to the beginning to prepare for the next crisis. With that, I'm finished with my slides, and Antonio, I'd be happy to take some questions if people have some.
Thanks so much, Professor Paul Verbinnen. It was excellent to hear you. And we have here some questions, but let me give some informations before. Please, the attendance list is already available in the chat. The students can click in the link to sign the attendance list. Please, remembering that it's necessary to attend the 2 classes today and tomorrow to receive the certificate. And there is a link to send questions and comments via chat or form. And we have here some questions, Professor. Well, let me start with the first one that is from Paulo, the student Paulo Silva, that is asking you to explain again what is a Black Swan event, please.
Sure. A Black Swan event is a major event that is hard to predict. A Black Swan event like COVID, nobody saw it coming. Very few people were prepared for a global pandemic. A Black Swan event can be a 1 in 100-year hurricane that wipes out a plant. You can prepare for them, but they become events that are not part of the day-to-day environment you live in. They are big, serious, and unexpected normally. That term, Black Swan, comes from the fact that most swans are white, and very, very rarely you find a black swan. And that is why they become called Black Swan events.
All right. Now we have another question from Susana Magalhães, another student, that is asking, what strategies should the organizations implement to effectively manage crises that are internally generated and core to the business, such as product failures or operational accidents?
Well, in an internal crisis where you've got something that's generated by a product gone wrong or something like that, first of all, you need to assess how it's impacting your stakeholders. And that would be, again, you would want to prioritize your stakeholders. Is it something that's impacted your customers? Is it something that has been generated by the fact that a senior executive behaved badly, was caught being corrupt, had overlooked intentionally safety measures that they should have been putting in place because it was too expensive or something like that. So you need to assess what the problem is, who is affected, and what you need to say to them. So again, the strategies can be very, very different depending on what that issue is. If it's a product that's gone wrong, that's impacting customers, I worked on one, for instance, where there were literally nightgowns being produced by a factory that turned out to be extremely flammable, meaning when somebody would be wearing one and they'd get close to a candle, it would go up in flames and people would be seriously burnt. The company that produced those nightgowns obviously had to pull them from the market, much like Tylenol had to pull its product from the market. They had to address the concerns directly with the victims who were injured. They had to communicate to their whole customer base what had happened, what they were doing to fix it. They wound up in litigation that they had to work through. And for several days, there was quite a bit of media attention, which impacted their reputation. So it took a while. It didn't stay in the news as long as a Boeing issue, but it turned into a serious issue for the company. They had to go back, assess how it happened that they produced these highly flammable nightgowns, and basically change their product planning to ensure that they had nightgowns in future that were obviously not so prone to catching on fire. So that'd be an example.
Yes, thanks. And Paul again with another question asking, how can companies ensure effective crisis management while balancing legal, financial, and communication challenges?
I think that you have all of those challenges. It's why you put a team around the table of people representing the legal part of the company. So you want your lawyers around the table, very important. You want your operations people around the table. You want your company leadership around the table, your investors, your investor relations people, your HR people. And it's usually somebody who's designated to respond to these kinds of situations, to get them all around a table to discuss the competing interests of what's going on and to assess how to balance those competing interests. Oftentimes, there is a significant debate, as there was in Boeing and as there is oftentimes in many other situations, where the lawyers take over. And I'm a huge fan of the lawyers. You have some, including my friend Tom, who's very good at bringing people together. Oftentimes, the quarterback, right, the person who manages the crisis is a general counsel of a company. They tend to come at situations looking at it through the lens of the legal liability. And that's important to understand it. And it's important for them to understand what you want to say and how you want to say it. And it's important for them to give their best advice on what they would suggest you not say, which would make it easier for them in litigation down the road. But the point I made earlier in the presentation is that you have to win, particularly if you have a large external customer base, you have to win in a court of public opinion, not just in a court of law. And lawyers who understand that you have a business to run and that you still need to keep your customers on side are oftentimes willing to make some trade-offs so that you can actually balance all of those competing interests. Again, probably the most important thing that gets discussed at the end of any kind of meeting like that with people in a crisis and in preparation is we need to maintain credibility. And an overly legalistic response could put you in a bad spot, as it did Boeing. A response that actually takes into consideration all of the different inputs from people who have constituencies to deal with is usually the better response and one that actually enables you to move faster into that second order area of the crisis phases.
We have a question from another student now, Yasmin Rodriguez. She wants to know about crisis internally generated and what strategies should organizations implement to effectively manage crises that are internally generated and core to the business, such as products failures or operational accidents?
Internally generated crises, it usually requires, obviously you have an external response, but what it usually is based on is whether it was it poor behavior from a CEO or a senior manager? Is somebody responsible for the problems? Did somebody miss something that they should have paid attention to? Was there enough attention? You need to ask all of these questions to determine, do you need, for instance, an investigation by an outside independent law firm into what happened to figure out, you can't solve a problem until you figure out how it happened, what caused it, and so on. That's the root cause. If it's bad behavior, you might have to fire somebody. If it's a bad mistake, you might demote somebody. If it's the failure of the organization more broadly, you need to go back and retool to figure out how you can prevent such a mistake again. So these are all questions where maybe maybe there's an external impact because everyone on the outside of the company is aware of it. If it's something that's generated internally, you need to move quickly, address the problem quickly, so that if it does get external exposure, you can point to how you moved responsibly to solve the problem.
Well, we have another one from Paulo that is asking about the Boeing Max accident in crisis. What were, how did Boeing handle reputation recovery efforts?
So give me that a second again.
How did Boeing handle reputation recovery efforts?
The person who was the lead director who took over as CEO, first of all, the CEO who was there, again, well-meaning, resigned under pressure. Things had gone badly up until that point, and it was perceived that they needed to do a lot. They did a cultural review. They had a board safety committee. The CEO who took over spent a lot of time promising to fix the problems in the production line, promising to be more transparent. They put a whole group together to assess how the problem happened and why the MCAS alert lights and so on had not been properly communicated to pilots in the earliest stages. So they did a complete root cause analysis of what happened, which is always the important first step in recovery. And there were significant things imposed on them, of course, including changes in how their regulators worked and so on. That process, obviously they did things like they slowed the assembly line. They basically stopped shipping airplanes for a while. They needed to spend a lot of time with their customers to reassure them that they were going to get things back on track. And they basically continued that kind of process. There were a number of other public relations initiatives that they put in place, including efforts to recognize and mourn, if you will, the victims and show true empathy for what had happened, including visits to the sites by some Boeing executives and so on. So they did all of that work. And then ultimately, because the second CEO, who'd been lead director there for a long time, was also somewhat tarnished by the fact that he'd been at Boeing when all of that happened. They brought in a new CEO a little more than a year ago, or around a year ago, who has further reinforced some of the fixes that they made in the culture, further focused on manufacturing processes, quality control, addressing some of the cultural issues that had cropped up, and reiterated their heavy focus on safety, and they also slowed down and reoriented customers to expect a slower number of deliveries so that they could ensure that the quality was there and that the problems that had beset not just the MAX, but a couple of other product lines would not recur. So it was a very lengthy process. And as I said, I think Boeing's reputation suffered terribly from that whole process. And theirs has been a multi-year recovery effort that continues to this day.
Excellent answer, Professor Paul. And I think we have one more question. I think that's great to finish. Another question from the student Yasmin. She's asking about the COVID-19 pandemic Did we learn something to manage crisis with the pandemic, and what were the most important things?
Well, again, that's the classic black swan event. I think the thing that, interestingly, um, at this point in history, in our technological development, probably one of the most significant things that happened was Zoom. And the fact that everybody had to try and figure out how to manage their companies while everybody was still at home. And that meant lots of communication to employees, clarity around what was expected. There were obviously some frontline employees who couldn't stay at home at a desk and talk to each other on Zoom. There was a significant effort to procure personal protective equipment to allow those people to be out in the public at a time when people did not understand what exactly what COVID was and how serious it might be. People did communicate at that time that this would have a significant impact on their businesses, so they had to spend a lot of money on kind of reorienting work streams and production lines to keep them going as much as possible. They had to tell investors, which the investors knew already, that their results would be significantly impacted. They had to communicate expectations of employees and work on new schedules to make sure that things that were critical to the business continuity would be done. It was a significant logistical nightmare for lots of management teams, and frankly, for most people, figuring out how to reorient their lives and their workspaces. Zoom was hugely helpful. We happened to be working for Zoom at the time, and interestingly, that became a mini crisis when Zoom, which was still a relatively new company, was almost overwhelmed by the demand that was suddenly placed on them. So it was that was an interesting side note on that particular crisis. But again, I think what did everyone learn? It's to think about in your crisis prep, organizational and business resiliency. What do you do if your principal location is no longer operative, right? That could happen in a hurricane. It could happen in a fire. What's your backup plan? Where do you keep your data when something happens? Who are the critical people that you need in an office or at a plant to keep it moving and secure? Those are the kinds of things that you can ask. And as I said, I think we all lived through that black swan event not that long ago. And I think a lot of people learned a lot about developing organizational resiliency as a result.
Excellent. Professor Paul, would you like to comment any other thing or highlight something?
No, I think it's again. I think the principles that I've outlined of basic collaboration, really having that multidisciplinary group at the table, having ideally some outsiders, trusted outsiders who can challenge some of the assumptions that you're making, make you think more broadly about a situation. Those are really key in making sure you prepare and to make sure that you do it on a regular basis. I talked earlier about the 5 or 6 key people that need to show up day or night. Make sure you have their phone numbers. Make sure that that they're still there, that their phone numbers are still active. There's nothing worse than having a crisis plan that you put a lot of time into. It sits around for 3 years, and when it comes time to execute, it's out of date, and the people that built the plan are no longer there or in the same positions. So it's a continual process, and it's one that, as I hope I've communicated, is quite complicated for many companies and quite extensive to make sure that again, it's being prepared to keep your business running when something goes sideways. And the fact is, most companies, no matter how well run or no matter how iconic, something will go wrong. And you need to be prepared to drill how you're going to deal with it. With that, I'll just say thanks for listening. And Antonio, thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak to your class.
Hello. Hi, I think there was a small problem with internet, but we listen to you. Thank you so much, Professor Paul Verbinnen, for being here and sharing with us your knowledge about crisis management. I think we had great questions here and the interactions during the class today. I would like to thank the students once again, and inform the students that this class you can watch again in our Google Classroom of our course, Crisis Management in the Public and Private Sectors, developed by Global July 2025 at Federal University of Juiz. Fora. And there you can find one more text to read about crisis management that is called the Crisis Management Process to spread the debate that we are having in our Google Classroom. So I would like to remember also that tomorrow we have another class at the same time, 2 p.m. in Brazil, to continue our course, and the attendance list is available on the chat, and it's necessary to sign today and tomorrow to complete the course with a certificate. So once again, thank you so much, Professor Paul Verbinnen. Thank you for accepting the invitation, for being with us and sharing all your knowledge about crisis management. And to the students, I see you again tomorrow in our next class. So I will finish the transmission here, but you can wait for me, Professor. And bye-bye, everyone.